The morning started with chaos. 3 city trucks pulled up to my curb, orange cones blocking half the street, and a crew of 6 workers in hard hats standing in my front yard like they were about to demolish a condemned building. I stood there in my bathrobe, coffee mug frozen halfway to my lips, watching as the crew chief examined my beautiful oak trees with a clipboard and a measuring tape. Across the street, I spotted her. Patricia Garrison, our HOA president, standing on her perfectly manicured lawn with her arms crossed and a smug smile plastered across her face. She was wearing her usual power suit, even though it was 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. The woman literally dressed for battle every single day. Let me back up and explain how I ended up with half the city's forestry department in my yard. My name is Daniel Foster, and I moved to Maplewood Gardens 3 years ago. I'm a freelance graphic designer who works from home, minds my own business, and thought buying a house in a quiet suburban neighborhood would be peaceful. I was wrong. Dead wrong. The trouble started 6 months ago when I decided to plant 3 oak trees along my property line. They were beautiful saplings, carefully selected from a reputable nursery and planted exactly according to city guidelines. I'd even checked the HOA rules, which stated trees were allowed as long as they didn't obstruct sidewalks or interfere with utilities. Mine were perfectly positioned 15 feet from any walkway and nowhere near power lines. But Patricia Garrison had other ideas. See, Patricia ran our HOA like she was the supreme dictator of a small nation. She measured grass height with an actual ruler, sent violation notices for garbage cans visible from the street at 3:01 p.m. instead of 3 p.m. sharp, and once tried to fine my neighbor for hanging wind chimes that she claimed exceeded acceptable decibel levels during moderate wind conditions. The first sign of trouble came 2 weeks after I planted the trees. A certified letter arrived stating I was in violation of HOA Guideline 17.4b, which apparently required board approval for any landscaping changes exceeding $50 in value. I ignored it, figuring she'd move on to terrorizing someone else. That was my first mistake. Next came the passive-aggressive tactics. Patricia started parking her car directly in front of my house during her morning walks, taking photos of my trees from every angle. She'd stand there for 20 minutes at a time, measuring tape in hand, documenting what she called in her emails to me as clear safety hazards and aesthetic disruptions to neighborhood harmony. Then she escalated to recruiting allies. She convinced 2 other board members that my trees would eventually damage the sidewalk, even though they were nowhere near it. She held special meetings about the tree situation, as she called it, and distributed flyers with badly photoshopped images showing my trees grown to monstrous proportions, crushing houses, and swallowing small children. I tried reasoning with her. I showed her the receipts from the nursery, proving these were slow-growth trees that would take decades to reach full size. I provided documentation from a certified arborist stating they posed no threat to infrastructure. I even offered to sign a liability waiver. Nothing worked. Patricia had decided my trees were her personal enemy, and she would not rest until they were gone. The situation reached absurd levels when she started calling various city departments. First, she reported me to code enforcement, claiming the trees violated setback requirements. The inspector came out, measured everything, and told her there was no violation. Then she called the utility company, insisting the trees would interfere with power lines. They sent someone out who laughed and said the trees would need to grow 40 feet taller to even come close to the lines. But Patricia wasn't done. She filed complaints with the health department, claiming the trees attracted dangerous wildlife. She called the fire department, suggesting they were fire hazards. She even contacted the postal service, arguing that falling leaves would create slip hazards for mail carriers. Each department dutifully investigated and found nothing wrong. That brings us back to this morning. Patricia had finally convinced someone at the city that my trees were planted without proper permits, which was completely false. But here they were, ready to remove my perfectly legal, professionally planted, carefully maintained oak trees. The crew chief, a burly man named Robert, walked over to me with his clipboard. He said, with a tired voice, that he had a work order to inspect and potentially remove 3 unpermitted oak trees. I told him they were absolutely permitted and invited him inside to see my documentation. I pulled out my folder, which had grown thick over the months of Patricia's harassment. I showed him the original permits, the nursery receipts, the arborist certification, the code enforcement clearance, and every other piece of paper I'd collected. Robert looked through everything carefully, then made a phone call. 20 minutes later, he walked back over to Patricia, who had now been joined by 3 other neighbors who supported her crusade. I couldn't hear the conversation from my porch, but I watched as Patricia's smug expression slowly morphed into confusion, then anger, then something approaching panic. Robert walked back to me and said, with a slight smile, that not only were my trees completely legal, but whoever had filed the false report could face fines for wasting city resources. He handed me a copy of his inspection report, which clearly stated that all 3 trees were properly permitted, professionally planted, and in full compliance with every single city regulation. But the best part was yet to come. As the city crews were packing up their equipment, Robert mentioned something interesting. He said that during his inspection, he'd noticed several violations on other properties in the neighborhood. Specifically, he pointed to Patricia's house, where she had installed a decorative pond without proper permits, built a pergola that exceeded height restrictions, and had removed a protected maple tree from her backyard last year. The color drained from Patricia's face as Robert explained that since he was already here on an official inspection, he was obligated to document all violations he observed. He would be filing his report with code enforcement, and she could expect to hear from them within the week. The fines, he mentioned casually, could reach up to $5,000 for the illegal tree removal alone. The pond and pergola would require retroactive permits, which would cost additional thousands, or they'd have to be removed entirely at her expense. Patricia stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She tried to stammer out an explanation, something about the previous owners and grandfather clauses, but Robert just shrugged and said she could explain it all to code enforcement. He suggested she might want to get a lawyer. As the city trucks pulled away, more neighbors had gathered, and word was already spreading about what had happened. Patricia's little power trip had backfired spectacularly. Someone mentioned that filing false reports was actually a misdemeanor and that the HOA board might need to reconsider whether someone facing potential criminal charges should remain as president. I stood on my porch, sipping my now cold coffee, watching Patricia retreat to her house. Her shoulders were slumped, and she was already on her phone, probably calling her lawyer. The other board members were huddled together, whispering and shooting glances at Patricia's house. Later that afternoon, I received an email from the HOA board. They were calling an emergency meeting to discuss the president's actions and the potential liability she had created for the association. The email noted that filing false city reports could expose the HOA to lawsuits and damage our community's relationship with city officials. By evening, I had neighbors stopping by to apologize for not speaking up sooner. They shared their own stories of Patricia's harassment, from measuring fence heights at 6 a.m. to issuing violations for invisible infractions. One elderly couple told me she had tried to fine them $300 because their doormat was 2 inches wider than regulation size. The emergency board meeting was held 3 days later. I attended, along with what seemed like half the neighborhood. Patricia sat at the board table, but she looked different. Gone was the power suit and confident smirk. She wore a simple sweater and kept her eyes down as resident after resident stood up to share their grievances. The board treasurer revealed that Patricia had used HOA funds to pay for the consultants she'd hired to build her case against my trees. That was misappropriation of funds, another potential legal issue. The secretary added that Patricia had been signing violation notices without board approval, which violated the HOA bylaws. When it came time to vote, it was unanimous. Patricia was removed from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. She was also banned from serving on any HOA committee for 5 years. As the vote was announced, Patricia stood up, grabbed her purse, and walked out without saying a word. But the consequences didn't end there. The next week, code enforcement hit her with $23,000 in fines. The illegal tree removal was $8,000. The unpermitted pond was $6,000. The pergola was $4,000, and there were additional fines for other violations they found during their investigation. She was also ordered to restore the protected tree, which would cost another $15,000. When Patricia received the final notice, I heard from a neighbor who lived next door to her that she broke down crying in her driveway. The papers scattered around her feet as she screamed that it wasn't fair and that she was just trying to protect property values.